All right, so again, 9/11. This is what it looked like. And here's the Pentagon. So it's an attack on both New York City with the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, and Pentagon. And of course, there was a plane that was crashed by the passengers in Western Pennsylvania. Because Afghanistan had harbored Al-Qaeda, meaning they'd allowed Al-Qaeda into their territory, the United States in 2001 invaded Afghanistan in an effort to overthrow the Taliban. And as of this recording in 2018, we're still there. So it's been 17 years, and we have not successfully overthrown the Taliban. But in 2001, we did enter in order to try to overthrow the Taliban and try to eliminate the threat of Al-Qaeda. Now, again, the problem being Al-Qaeda was not Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is a stateless organization. It is a group that goes across different borders. So it's a bit problematic. And then 2 years later, in 2003, the United States led what could best be described as a war of choice into Iraq. The United States argued that Saddam Hussein, not having lost his ability to cause destruction. In fact, the United States government argued that the Iraqis had created weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. In fact, they went so far as to argue that they could potentially be making nuclear weapons. It turns out that they weren't. But in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq in order to remove Saddam Hussein. And there we go. This led to that power vacuum that the United States was so worried about after the Persian Gulf War. So after Hussein, the United States tried to establish democratic government. It didn't work. There was resistance to it. You have to understand a bit of the political situation of Iraq, which is kind of complicated, and I don't really want to get into it. But there is a power vacuum which allowed groups like ISIS to form. ISIS is kind of on the ropes now, but back in 2013-14, ISIS was growing in power and was becoming quite a boogeyman in the United States. The power vacuum created by the loss of that strong man in Iraq allowed ISIS to form in northern Iraq and in Syria. In 2018, we're still having issues in Syria. There's a civil war there that's causing problems. We're still having issues in Iraq. And I know all of this is very brief. We still have issues in the Middle East. Controversially, President Obama tried to and achieved a deal with Iran. Iran had been trying to develop nuclear weapons, and President Obama signed a limit on their nuclear capabilities. That is something the conservatives did not like, and now that there is a conservative government in charge, there is talk of getting rid of that nuclear arms deal. There's been issues in Syria. Currently, there's still a civil war in Syria, and we are having issues with the Russians there in addition to the Syrians. And again, it's politically complicated, and I don't want to get bogged down into that. So let's move on to some domestic stuff for the 80s and 90s. This is stuff that's happening within the United States. Now, part of Reagan's policy was, again, that economic conservatism, cut taxes, cut spending, but he increased all of that defense spending. So we can see that the debt nearly tripled during Reagan's and then George H.W. Bush's presidency. And at the end of the Bush presidency, see, George Bush became a bit of a hero during the 90s. The Persian Gulf was very successful. The war was quick. It happened. It was over quickly. We had a rousing victory, and then a recession hit at the end of Bush's presidency, which opened a window for the Democrats. And Bill Clinton is elected in 1992 with the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." Okay. Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. The reason he didn't win the majority of the electoral vote was because this man here in the middle, Ross Perot, ran as an independent, and Perot split off some of George H.W. Bush's votes, and Clinton was able to win the presidency with a plurality of the vote and a majority of the Electoral College. But it is the economy, right? So the economy is going to be the issue that he ran on. It's the issue that he's going to focus on domestically. The thing is, Republicans didn't really like Bill Clinton. Clinton was seen as problematic for them. There's a number of reasons for this. Again, don't want to get bogged down in the politics of the 90s. Long story short, Clinton is going to be impeached during, I believe, his second term. During the midterms in his first term, the Republicans took control of the House. They're going to impeach Clinton after something called the Starr Report, named after a guy named Ken Starr, who found out that he had had an affair with a House intern. Clinton had some sexual picadillos, to say the least. But let's not get too bogged into that. They accused him of lying under oath, which is perjury, which is illegal. The House brought him up on impeachment charges. The Senate refused to convict him and remove him from office. They allowed him to stay in office with a slap on the wrist. He was censured, I believe. But anyways, because of this conflict between the Republican-controlled Congress and the Democratic-controlled White House executive branch, they had to come up with some bipartisan solutions. Bipartisan meaning both parties agreed, both Democrats and Republicans agreed on how to fix things. In this case, the economy. So they fixed the economy by, interestingly, Clinton argued for a tax increase, so they increased taxes. The Republicans wanted to cut spending, so they cut spending. The Democrats were able to get what's called an earned income tax credit for low earners. So this is some demand side economics, right? So people that don't have money now have money that they can go and spend into the economy. So instead of trickle down or supply side economics where the money goes to the wealthy and then it trickles down, this is money is called demand side. So the poor get money and then it goes up towards the businesses. What this led to was a reduction of the deficit to the point where in 1998, 99, and 2000, we were actually paying down the national debt. The deficit turned into a surplus and the national debt was being paid off, which leads us, I mean, there were still problems with inequality. The inequality or the amount that the wealthy were making compared to the poor, the difference was growing starting in the 80s, continues through the 90s and into the 2000s, and that's one of our major issues today in 2018. Now, conservatives argue that Clinton benefited from a peace dividend, that he didn't have to pay so much for the military and that he could shrink the military because he didn't have to fight the Cold War, and that might be true, but the military never shrunk as much as what popular conception would have you think. It did shrink a bit, but the military spending never went as low as what people thought. Either way, when he leaves office in 2000, there was a surplus, and we were actually paying down the national debt. The deficit no longer existed. We were collecting more in taxes than we were spending in government services. And then in 2000, that becomes another issue. In 2000, George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, runs for office. And in 2000, there was a very controversial election. Neither George Bush nor Al Gore won a majority. Well, going into the last state that reported, neither one of them had an electoral college victory. And in Florida, the race was very close. And I don't want to get bogged down in this. Some counties that traditionally voted Democrat voted Republican, which led, and the race was close enough that Al Gore wanted to have a recount. The election, this controversy goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ends the recount. This is called Bush versus Gore. The Supreme Court had 5 conservative judges and 4 liberal judges. The 5 conservatives voted together in the majority to say that the recount should end. The 4 liberals opposed the ending of the recount. Liberals, Democrats, will say that the Supreme Court had voted in favor of the Republicans simply for partisan reasons. And we can see kind of a connection to that 1960s Warren Court thing, right? Where liberals now are going to be upset about the Supreme Court. And that swings back hard later on. But in the 2000 election, the Supreme Court ended the recount, which basically gave George W. Bush the victory. Oh, weird thing, George W. Bush's brother was the governor of Florida at the time. Anyways, as a Republican, once he's in office, George W. Bush supported supply-side economics, that trickle-down economics where you cut taxes and you give money to the wealthy, and that wealth will then trickle down to everybody else, and it will stimulate the economy. So George W. Bush cut taxes. it accelerates sort of the economic disparity between the rich and the poor, but we can skip that. He cuts taxes, and then after 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan, and then in 2003 invaded Iraq, and that whole peace dividend disappears. And we increased defense spending while keeping taxes low, so we didn't pay for all that defense spending. So what was a budget surplus was knocked down because of the tax cuts. Right, so we had sort of an equal deficit neutral, right? And then we went to war, and what had been a surplus being cut down by the taxes now was back to a deficit. And then at the end of the Bush presidency, all of those tax cuts and the deregulation of various industries led to a housing bubble, and that bubble burst in 2008, and the economy crashed. And then because we'd already had a deficit, we spent more money to try to help people, and we tried to stimulate the economy by putting more money into it, just like what we saw during the Great Depression. And then we tried to bail out the banks that had failed so that the banks didn't fail, which would lead to even worse. Remember the Great Depression when all the banks failed there. All of this leads to more debt. And because the unemployment rate was above 10%, tax revenues fell. And all those people are collecting insurance, social insurance programs like food stamps and uninsurance plans. And that means that there's more debt. And what had been a surplus led to a massive deficit in 2008. And then the national debt spiked accordingly. And that seems really bad until you look at the fact that it's really more of a slow growth. But it's scary. And I think we need to move on to some other issues.